It's a pleasure to participate on behalf of CAF, Latin American Development Bank, of such an interesting discussion on global trade at crossroads in the perspective for Latin America, organized by the Georgetown Americans Institute. First of all, I would like to thank the Institute's founding director, Alejandro Werner, for this kind of invitation and stress the relevance of the issues that will be discussed here for CAF's statutory mandate on promoting sustainable development and regional integration all over LAC region. Since September last year, under the leadership of Mr. Sergio Diaz-Granado, the bank is on full throttle on its strategic move to become the green bank for the economic recovery of Latin American and Caribbean region. And by all means, economic recovery and trade will go hand in hand. To support this strategy, a clear view on the consequences of recent trades and recent trends of global trade, especially on the so-called path for deglobalization, is a central piece for our action. Therefore, CAF recently engaged with a joint action with the JIE, focused on understanding how these trends can unfold into a nearshoring process and map which countries will absorb its major impacts. For today's discussion, we are pleased to welcome Mrs. Anabel Gonzalez, Deputy Director of World Trade Organization. To moderate the session, we will have a top-tier specialist and a longtime friend of mine, Mr. Anthony Estevado Ordal. Thanks all of you for your attention. And Tony, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tony. It's nice seeing you, even though it's in a virtual format after so many years. Thanks to the Institute, to the Georgetown Americas Institute for hosting this event, to Alejandro Werner for organizing it, and especially to Anabel Gonzalez to accepting this invitation to be in her alma mater. I think you were here as a student a long time ago, and so welcome to Georgetown. As Antonio mentioned, Anabel is now the Deputy Director of the World Trade, Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization in Geneva. She was there some time ago as a Director General for Agriculture at the WTO, and she had many posts as really a global expert on trade issues. She was Minister of Foreign Trade in Costa Rica. She was the Director General of CINDE, the main agency in Costa Rica to attract foreign direct investment, and also spent some time also as a Senior Director at the Global Practice for Trade and Competitiveness at the World Bank. So she has a very wide, broad experience, also in the private sector, by the way. You had also, so I think we couldn't have any best person to have this conversation today. And we ask Anabel to start the conversation, especially in your current position at the WTO, to tell us a little bit about the health of the global trading, the multilateral trading system, I would say. What's, the kind of a health check. You are inside the body. You can tell us what's happening there. There was some good news this year in June with the ministerial, a very successful ministerial after many years. I would say decades of successful rounds in the WTO. So I think there was some very good news coming out from Geneva in June. And also there's, lots of discussions in Geneva about the role of the WTO in the future, what type of the new WTO we need. So why you don't just spend a few minutes before we start the conversation, just, telling us what happened in Geneva in June, in this ministerial, where the WTO is heading in this new kind of context. And after that, we will just engage in a little bit more in conversation in issues that maybe touch more to our economies in Latin America. Anabel, thanks for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tony, and thanks to you and Alejandro and Antonio. I'm delighted to be here at the Georgetown Americas Institute. And I think that the title that you have chosen for this event, Global Trade at a Crossroads, is right on point. Multilateral trade cooperation has underpinned decades of trade-led growth and development that have lifted hundreds of billions of people out of poverty and has reduced the gaps between rich and poor countries, even if some people and countries have been left behind and the pandemic has eroded some of these gains. Now, today, multilateral trade cooperation is under stress. Widening geopolitical risk and trade tensions, the war in Ukraine, supply chain disruptions, high prices of food, fertilizers, and energy, rising inflation, the risk of debt distress, the omnipresent threat of climate change, and the lingering effects of the pandemic. So all of this and more is pushing uncertainty to new heights and raising doubts over many of the assumptions that have been at the core of decades-old efforts to integrate global markets. Latin America, of course, is not exempt from these challenges. So what I would like to do in this first few minutes, if that's okay with you, Tony, is to make three points. The first one is that Latin America and the Caribbean countries, and I would say the world at large, need the global trading system. The second point is that amid all the challenges, the WTO 12 Ministerial Conference that you referred to, Tony, delivered outcomes that are good and that are good for Latin America. And the third point is that more is needed to adapt the WTO to the 21st century. And I think Latin American countries can play an important role in doing this. So on the first point on the need for a global trading system, I probably should start by saying that many see globalization as having gone too far, global value chains as too risky, and multilateral cooperation as passive. Nevertheless, I believe that multilateral trade cooperation is more necessary today than it ever was. Necessary because tackling some of the big global challenges that we have, like climate change, like the pandemic, need coordinated action by the many, cannot be sorted out among just a group of countries. Necessary also because, contrary to the common perception, the role of international trade as a transmitter of shocks is largely offset by its role as a shock absorber. And we can look, for instance, at what happened during the pandemic, where really, after some initial disruption, trade and global value chains were absolutely critical to deliver foods, medical supplies, and other key critical supplies across the world. The numbers, I think, tell a very clear story. While global merchandise trade decreased by 7% in 2020, trade in medical products increased by 16%. Now, trade and global value chains were also instrumental for the production and distribution of the vaccines that were so important in the fight against COVID, with hundreds of specialized inputs coming from many countries across the globe. And of course, global trade growing twice as fast as output last year, trade was also a key driver of the economic recovery from the pandemic. Now, aside from trade and the role of trade in addressing global challenges, the role of trade as a shock absorber, I think it's also important to highlight that trade cooperation is necessary to create new economic opportunities for job creation, for innovation, for investment for all countries, particularly for those that have still to integrate into global value chains and trade more broadly. And I think that in a way, this is the case for Latin America, because the region has so far mostly missed the boat in global value chain integration, though there are important differences across countries, of course. Now, on average, the region is weakly integrated into these global production networks compared with Europe, say, and East Asia. And intra-regional supply chains are particularly weak. And of course, Tony, having worked for many years, and Alejandro as well, know this very well. Now, much of this disappointing performance is to a large extent explained, if you wish, by some adverse fundamentals, some countries in the region are far from global production hubs. For example, some may have weak institutions, some have small markets, some have do not necessarily have the skills or the technology that is required. But it's also important to note that policies in the region, including trade policies, have often fallen short of what is needed to actually overcome the challenges that are caused by the adverse fundamentals. And what I mean by this is that trade policies in Latin America and the Caribbean could do much more to reduce high costs that businesses in the region face when trading across borders. Policies have not done enough to facilitate trade and border delays, improve regulatory cooperation, open services trade, and foster more competition in domestic markets. As a result of that, productivity growth and growth in general, which have both been longstanding and serious problems in the region, have suffered as a result of all this. So the bottom line, first point, is that multilateral trade cooperation remains essential for Latin American and Caribbean countries, and indeed for the world's future economic and security prospects. And that's why the news coming out of our 12th ministerial conference in the WTO, held last June, is so encouraging. And this is my second point. The ministerial gathering, which is the WTO's most important body, sent a strong and unequivocal message to the world that multilateral trade cooperation can still deliver relevant outcomes on pressing issues, even in the toughest of geopolitical circumstances. And let me briefly highlight a few of the outcomes of this ministerial conference and comment briefly on their impact for Latin America. First, WTO reform. The decision by ministers to launch a process of reforming the WTO is arguably the most important outcome resulting from the ministerial conference. At the core of this decision, there is a mandate to review all WTO functions, the function of deliberation and monitoring, the negotiating function, and the dispute settlement function. And I think that the main thrust of this is to adapt the organization to the challenges of the 21st century. And I think it sends a clear message that governments want to give a fighting chance to multilateral trade cooperation, despite the geopolitical risks and growing competition over trade, technology, and security. And I think that's good news for what is a relatively small trading region as Latin America. Latin America basically has 5% of participation in world merchandise exports and 3% of world services exports. So clearly, the potential for expanding trade in the region is huge, and I would add much needed. But the chances to turn that potential into reality diminished dramatically in a world where the global trading system is out of sync with the realities of the 21st century, and even worse, where the rules-based trading system is abandoned in favor of more inferior power-based mechanisms. Now, WTO reform creates an opportunity to strengthen the system of global trade and avoid what would be clearly a lose-lose outcome if the world economy were to be divided into or fragmented into. And it also creates the opportunity to bring in a number of countries and regions from the margins of the global economy into the mainstream. Now, central to WTO reform is having a fully functional dispute settlement system, which is a cornerstone of the rules-based trading order, and which is currently not working as intended. For Latin American countries, this is very important. Some of these countries are very active users of the dispute settlement system. They have initiated about a quarter of the over 600 cases that have been decided at the WTO. And this, as I said before, greatly exceeds their participation in global trade, which is a signal that the system, countries in the region need the system to defend their trade interests. The second outcome that I want to highlight very briefly is an agreement on fishery subsidies that was reached at the ministerial. This is very important because depletion of fisheries in the ocean, driven in part by subsidies that are given by governments, is posing significant threats not only to the health of the oceans, but of the livelihood of people who depend on fisheries as well. This is an agreement that had been in the making for a very long time, and it's very valuable in itself, but also because this is the first agreement in the WTO that puts environment at the center of the trading system. And this, I think, opens opportunities on the one hand for the WTO to be more proactive or adopt a more proactive role in helping fight climate change and foster more broadly environmental objectives. But it also opens the door for new trade opportunities. And I think for Latin America, this is important. For example, in 2019, the region was responsible for 14% of global marine fisheries production. But more broadly, the region has a latent green competitiveness advantage that could be exploited. So it's no surprising that many countries, Latin American countries in the WTO, are very active on the environmental front. Several of them actually chair negotiations or co-chair negotiations. Costa Rica, Ecuador, Barbados, and a number of them are also very active in participating in the negotiation. And the last outcome I want to highlight is it's not really an outcome of the ministerial, but it's very recent. It's an agreement that has a very dull name. I have to warn you. It's the reference paper on services domestic regulation. We have a knack for coming up with these names that not very attractive. But it is a very attractive agreement in many ways, because basically it covers the services sector, and we know that the services sector is very important in terms of participation in the global economies, for jobs, for FDI, and in many other areas as well. And this agreement basically covers 67 members so far, which represent 90% of services trade, and looks at slashing red tape in this area, improving transparency, and the impact is estimated at $150 billion annually. So it is not a minor thing. It's also important because it's a plurilateral agreement. Not all WTO members are part of it. All can become part of it if they wish. And I think there's also points about the way forward with the WTO sort of housing different options for negotiation, the multilateral option, the plurilateral option, etc. So the third and my third and final point is that our ministerial conference, though very successful, did not reach an outcome on several important issues. One of it is agriculture, which for Latin American Caribbean countries is very relevant, particularly some countries, as we all know, in South America are powerhouses in the area of agricultural trade, and lack of an outcome in this area is something that is of concern. This is particularly the case now, where we are seeing a number of export restrictions and other measures that are being put in place that are having a very negative impact on trade in food, in fertilizers, and are contributing to higher prices in this area. In addition to agriculture, another important area for Latin America relates to the level playing field or competitive neutrality, or the issue of subsidies that have been increasing quite significantly in areas of agriculture, manufacturing, services, and others. So all this to say that in addition to what is coming out of our ministerial conference, there is also a very important agenda going forward, taking into account other issues. So since we are at a Jesuit institution, let me conclude by quoting from St. Ignatius of Loyola, who once said, "He who is not getting better is getting worse." And of course, I think he did not have the WTO in mind. He was thinking more about our spiritual lives. But nevertheless, I think this aligns with our systems of international governance and institutions. So, if we do not work to adapt the system to the realities of 21st century, it risks eroding its value for people, for businesses, and for societies around the world. I am encouraged by what we saw at the ministerial conference, but definitely much more is needed. And I trust that Latin American countries have a very important role. So with that, let me stop here.
Annabelle, for this great diagnostics of what's happening at the WTO in Geneva. Let me just start this conversation, maybe zooming on some of the things that you already touched on what's the kind of this global context in which trade is playing today. I think that you said at the beginning that geopolitical tensions, security concerns are playing a growing role in the way that countries define their trade policies, strategies. I would like to confirm with you that you agree with this assessment. That this is a concern. We are kind of putting aside sometimes the kind of more the traditional economic fundamentals on why we should do trade policy, and other types of objectives are becoming prominent in these discussions. That will be probably the first question, but getting a little bit more into the details of that, and you mentioned the topic, is partly in response to these geopolitical concerns, the security issues. There's this discussion about how, and because of the shocks that we had, the COVID shock and the Russian invasion in Ukraine and so on, we have faced as never before the vulnerability of these global value chains, the way that we have been trading for the last 2 decades. Vulnerability that sometimes is associated with where you produce things. There's a vulnerability there, or how you move things, how you transport things, and both things have been affected by these shocks. And this situation has prompted a debate. We see in the press, economic press, almost every day, on the potential for reshoring, countries bringing back production that they had before in other countries, on nearshoring, placing inputs nearby their markets, or even much more recently, and I think has been something that has been called for even in this US administration, the kind of the new slogan, which is friendshoring. It's not only a closing neighbor, but actually a friend neighbor, someone who shares political and economic principles with you. I think this kind of debate has missed a little bit, the actual capacity that the governments have to actually implement these policies, especially in the developing world, maybe less in other countries. And also, I think has underplayed the actual capacity that the business sector has to actually react to these vulnerabilities. They have done this for many, many years in terms of, looking for different alternative sourcings, for standardizing inputs and so on. So this has been a little bit underplayed. In the region, this debate is very interesting. As I think you mentioned, there's some people who believe that this could be a big bang for the region, it's kind of a game changer. And others think that this will be a very kind of a neutral thing, nothing much gonna happen. Probably the truth for depending which countries, which sector is going to be in the middle. There's some opportunities there. So I'd like you to comment on that. What the data tells us. You in the WTO, you guys are monitoring this data pretty closely. Do we have data that shows that this is actually happening? And if so, what are some of the opportunities that the region may have? And what is the role for the government? You were at CINDE in Costa Rica. You were successful bringing some important industries. Intel in Costa Rica has been in the news very recently again. So tell us a little bit your views on this.
So take your question in two parts first. And the earlier advance of globalization relied on what Christine Lagarde, president of the European Central Bank, said once, which is a Goldilocks scenario of relatively economic and geopolitical stability. And within this scenario, trade policy largely focused on what trade policy normally does, right? Which is market opening, leading to greater specialization, taking advantage of economies of scale, etc. But the Goldilocks era is in the rearview mirror, right? And many governments, particularly in some of the larger players, are focusing their trade policy not so much on efficiency considerations, but more on this geopolitical and security elements that you were mentioning, Tony. And in the meantime, many other countries, including those in Latin America, are asking themselves basically how do they fit into this rapidly changing and complex environment. And we don't know yet how all of this will play out. One can think of a more benign scenario, for example, where the largest trading partners would pursue different combinations, for instance, of geostrategic competition, coexistence, cooperation, and maybe even convergence, depending on the topic. But it is also true that in a world that splinters into opposing blocks, there is a significant risk. And in this context, the rules-based trading system would probably be superseded by more power-oriented mechanisms. Now, I think, and to make the transition to your second question, I want to say that I think we should be under no illusion about how costly the splintering scenario would be. So WTO economists have looked into this, and they've estimated that if the world were to be fragmented into two competing blocks, the resulting loss of specialization and technology spillovers would lower the long run level of real GDP growth by 5%. This is not a minor number. If we think, for instance, about how the financial crisis hit OECD countries, that impact was around 3.5%. So this is quite serious. So in this context, I think that Latin American countries probably have to follow a two-pronged approach as it regards their trade policy. And I will connect to the issue of global value chains very soon. One is to continue to support the strengthening of the multilateral trading system. We referred to that before. And the second one is a topic which I know is close to your heart, Tony, which is regional integration in Latin America. And we know that there is much more that can be done in this area. Now, it is true that this changing landscape opens new opportunities. I mean, the reconfiguration of global supply chains is to a certain extent justified, if you wish. Companies looking at balancing or reaching a different balance in terms of efficiency and risk management, and companies are sort of increasing inventories or entering into long-term contracts with suppliers, diversifying suppliers, and all this is very relevant. Now, whether this reconfiguration of supply chains will benefit Latin American countries or not, I think it's still an open question, although I tend to be cautiously optimistic. And I say this first because we are still not seeing, except in very specific sectors, for instance, semiconductors, we are still not seeing this decoupling or fragmentation in the numbers. Actually, global merchandise trade at the end of this year will be higher than ever in real terms, by 8 to 10% above where it was at the end of 2019. So it is not that easy for companies to just move around, particularly where they've made significant investments. There are ecosystems that support their participation in trade and others. Now, the countries who will benefit from this, I think, are those who have made their homework. And the homework, I would say, in the case of trade policy, is related probably with what I like to call the 3 C's. One is increased connectivity. The second one is fostering competition. And the third one is climbing the value chain. And in terms of increasing connectivity, there is much that the region can do in terms of, we were saying, bringing in technology to facilitate trade. Again, an area where you, Tony, have worked for a long time in the region with some important progress, but still more to be done. It also relates to the issues of infrastructure and logistics that are also important in the region. It also relates to bringing down barriers to trade in goods and services. So there is still an important agenda for the region in terms of increasing connectivity in a broader sense. Likewise, in terms of fostering competition in domestic markets. And I think this is particularly important, to make sure that Latin American countries facilitate the entry, the survival, and the growth of firms in the domestic market. We know that in Latin America, normally in most countries in the region, there are a few large firms, but then there is a large mass of smaller firms, many of them in the informal sector, that actually, cannot connect or do not have the necessary conditions to participate in value chain. So this agenda of opening, competition in a number of important services that are at the backbone of economies, be it finance, be it transport, be it energy, be it others, I think it's critical. The third part relates to, doing more to help firms climb the value chain. And here, of course, the need for bringing sort of services and digital services trade to the center of the policy agenda is quite critical. And I'm only talking about trade. Of course, this is related to much, broader policies, human capital development, and others that are critical. So countries that are able, to engage in reform in these domestic areas, I think could have an opportunity to leverage all this reconfiguration of global supply.
Just maybe elaborating on one point that you just made on the need to strengthen the capacity of the region to do better on regional integration, not only among themselves, but also with the main partners. You were a negotiator of CAFTA, so you know how important it is to negotiate these type of agreements with partners like the United States. But it looks like now that the rules of the games are changing for these type of trade agreements. And I wanted you to reflect a little bit on that. I mean, we could talk about Europe, we could talk about maybe some countries in Asia. I'll just maybe talk about the case of the US because we are here now in DC, and the US has definitely changed the way that they are engaging other partners in the type of traditional trade agreements that they use to support. This started in the previous administration with the abandoning of the TPP. That was one political issue. Then they renegotiated NAFTA into an USMCA now, which is same, but with some important differences. But most importantly, in this administration, we are seeing different types of modalities for engaging partners at the global, in the global trade. They sign importantly outside the region this India-Pacific Economic Framework. For Latin America, more importantly, in the Summit of the Americas, this year they would launch this Alliance for Economic Partnership and Prosperity, which is in a way similar to this IPEF. Close to your heart, the United States also signed this partnership with three Central American and the Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, Panama, and now Ecuador is also part of it, what is called the Alliance for Democracy in Development. And the kind of the coincidence thing of this type of frameworks is that one, they exclude the traditional market access negotiations, it's not there anymore. And second, they always talk about this potential for engaging these partners in more resilient supply chain. So that's definitely where things are going. Of course, this is connected with some of the industrial policy that is being kind of pushed forward in this country. But as I said, this is here in the United States, but I think similar arguments we could make it for Europe and other partners. So the question is, what's your view? How Latin America should react to that? Taking into account that also the politics in Latin America are very different. They are much inclined to the type of traditional agreements and maybe more inclined to new type of modalities. So the environment for Latin America is complex than ever before because you don't have not only to deal with many countries, many partners, you have to deal with different type of modalities and how to actually craft this type of deals. What's your view? How Latin America should respond to that?
I think, Tony, that a trade policy for many Latin American countries should focus on two main areas. One, as I was saying before, is the strengthening of the multilateral trading system, because Latin American countries with 5.4% of participation in global trade really depend on the system to advance their interests, defend their interests. So, and to me, one of the interesting things that I have found since I arrived to the WTO almost a year and a half ago is that Latin American countries do play that active role, and that is so irrespective of their of sort of like the ideology of the different countries in the region. And you see the countries coming together, for instance, and presenting joint proposals between, say, Brazil and Argentina and Mexico and Panama and Costa Rica and Colombia on many different issues. And I think that that is a reflection of the understanding that these countries have that a strengthened system is very important for them. It's also critical because it can help Latin American countries sort of navigate the course without having to choose among trading partners, because that is absolutely critical. Now, there are also so that's the first point. The second point is that it is important for countries in the region to use their trade policy to leverage what the current conditions are. And the current conditions, sort of signal different things. One is the need for, diversify and build resilience into supply chains, as you were saying. Well, by engaging with their trading partners, Latin American countries can do that, and they can become important sources. They can bring important opportunities, for instance, for foreign direct investment. They can also help in secure the supply chains. But again, they need to work on the fundamentals back home. The other element that is important is that in this context, there are new opportunities arising from, and I would like to highlight three. One is digital. The second one is services. And the third one is green opportunities. In each of these areas, I say many trading partners are aligned. For instance, in the case of digital, many of them are negotiating an agreement on electronic commerce at the WTO, but also at the regional or bilateral level, digital trade agreements are becoming increasingly relevant. So this is, important to have an eye on this. The second area relates to services. I really think that services trade has, an unexploited potential. In Latin America, digital services trade in particular are critical. Brazil is the largest exporter, but then you also have countries like Argentina, like Costa Rica, like Mexico, all of which also have an important participation in this area. But again, I mentioned it before, the participation of LAC is still very small, and there's opportunity to grow there. And the third area that I really want to mention is that of the opportunities for green trade. And here, as I said, Latin America is, I think, in a very good position. Not only, these countries have normally a greener greed than other parts of the region. They are relatively small contributors to carbon emissions. They also have normally a greener sort of electricity. They have opportunities for hydrocarbons. So in the region, really, this is something where the region could think more about this. So even in the context, in this sort of very challenging context that you were describing, I think a combination of working at the multilateral level and leveraging the opportunities that at the bilateral or regional level can come, be it in digital, be it in service, be it in the green economy, that I think that there is a lot that can be done there.
I actually had my last question was actually what you mentioned, the service trade. This is, I think, I agree with you. Is still a small part of most of economies, and but I think it's a growing trade component. We always we shouldn't forget, and Richard Baldwin has made this argument very recently, very forcefully, that we try to associate the peak of globalization after the financial crisis, when basically the percentage of global trade peak and then just kind of went down. This didn't happen with services. The percentage of trade in services over GDP is continuing growing. It's still small, of course, but still importantly. And one of the reasons that he made the argument is that the trade barriers in services are still very large compared to trade in goods. So there's still a huge scope for dismantling this type of trade barriers. And most interestingly is that these trade barriers are not regulatory, are mostly technological. And through the digital kind of economy and the type of digital technologies that we are seeing, will be much easier to actually dismantle this type of. So I think the future of services, I think, is something to watch. And I think you made some good examples, some good cases for Latin America. Maybe just to end a very general question, going back to the original conversation, and then we will open up for questions. And you touched it a little bit at the very end of your last intervention when you talk about green trade. We start talking about the importance of multilateral trade cooperation as a global public good. And I think more and more we see this global public good interconnected with other global public goods, right? The climate change, the health issues. I know that there's a lot of work being done in the WTO. I think you have been very in the front run, I think, in many of these issues. So maybe to finalize this initial conversation, can you tell us a little bit about how you see the future of this kind of connecting these different global public goods with the trade agenda, something that, in the past was not so clear?
I think, Tony, that multilateral trade cooperation is a very valuable tool to tackle some of these global challenges. And let me focus on climate change, which you mentioned. I think that when one thinks about what role can trade play as it regards climate change, one can think of at least three important elements. One is that multilateral trade cooperation can help maintain an open and stable environment that is absolutely critical to attract the investments, the massive investments that are required to support the green transition. So that, I think, is a very important role. And here, for instance, there are discussions happening in the WTO, and I would not be surprised if we would see, for instance, in some time, the negotiation of an agreement on environmental goods and services, for example. That could help slash trade barriers that still impact trade of environmental goods. The second one is that the multilateral trade cooperation is also critical to help manage trade frictions, because this transition to a net zero economy will not be frictionless. There are measures that governments are adopting unilaterally that may create impact or may bring an impact on others. And it is important that, to have a forum where these measures can be discussed. If they may be, may be related to subsidies, for example, in some areas, may be related to border adjustment measures in others. But having a forum where these measures can be discussed, I think, is particularly important. And the third area, in addition to sort of underpinning an open and stable trade system and providing a forum for managing trade frictions, is also making a difference on climate adaptation. And I think this issue is critical. If one thinks about the Caribbean, for example, 8 of the 20 top countries that have suffered by extreme weather events, that have suffered losses in their GDPs, are Caribbean countries. So for this and many other countries, trade can provide a vital lifeline, for example, for food supplies at some point that are necessary after the reconstruction of a natural disaster. I think trade will also be critical in buffering the negative long-term impacts of climate change by moving food from one region to another. So, overall, the potential for trade to contribute to climate change and other global other problems of the global commons, I think, is quite significant.
For some questions, I think we have like 10 minutes maybe before our closing, and I think there's some micros there. If you could identify yourself and just make a short question.
Thank you. My name is Tariq Mahmoud Pasha. I'm from Bangladesh. I'm studying in the MSFS program in Georgetown. My question is that very recently, Bangladesh and 5 other countries who are going to graduate from LDC status, they applied for extension of their LDC benefits because of the existing global situation, supply shock, crisis, and everything. So, what is WTO's opinion on this issue, and what is the reaction of other countries on this issue? Thank you, ma'am.
Question. I think what Bangladesh has achieved in the past decades is nothing from remarkable. And being in the condition to graduate from least developed country into developing country is a major achievement. Now, and trade has played a critical role in that, as we all know. Now, it is also the case that then there needs to be a transition period where a country moves from one stage to another. And right now at the WTO, the discussion is what should that transition period be for countries like Bangladesh who are moving from least developed to developing. And there are different views. Some countries would like to see a longer transition period where rules of the WTO will apply to them at one particular stage. Others would like to look at shorter or longer. So the issue is not whether there should be a transition or not. I think there's an understanding that there should be a transition, but the question is how long this transition would last. I have to end maybe by saying that this is a good problem to have because we want to see more countries like Bangladesh moving from least developed country status to developing countries, and hopefully into middle income and then higher income countries.
Thank you. Hi, Mateo Haydar. I'm with the Latin American Studies program, first year master student. Thank you for being here and for your great comments. You mentioned the 3 C's for Latin America. I thought that was very interesting and kind of and countries that you mentioned might be performing better and doing their homework in that roadmap. What are those countries that come to mind? And what are some of the challenges, particularly when you think of competitiveness, right? Thinking of the geopolitical landscape and even some of the internal politics in some of these countries, is there a roadmap to kind of lay out a regional strategy for competitiveness that you see, or some challenges along the way that present themselves?
If you look at different indicators, Latin American countries tend to score on the mid to lower range of those indicators, and this suggests that there is an important opportunity for implementing structural reforms in the region. I think that the priorities may vary across countries, but let me focus on a few which I think are relevant. I mentioned the issue of bringing greater competition into the domestic economy. This is an issue that this is an area where countries could adopt measures pretty much irrespective of what's going on in the outside world. In the sense that it is true that Latin America countries are dependent on what happens in the rest of the world in many areas, but in some others they can adopt their own structural reforms. And one area where most Latin American countries are lagging is in the area of competition, and this impacts, as I said, it relates, for instance, to services that are the backbone of the economy in many countries in the region. But this, when you come to think in the current context, for example, of high inflation, introducing greater competition in the region could also contribute to taming down inflation in some of these countries. So greater competition in the economy is critical. The second one, which is to a certain extent related, is the business environment. Again, looking at different international indicators, countries in the region normally score high in terms of red tape or bureaucratic processes, be it in terms in the area of trade facilitation or being in terms of attracting foreign direct investment and others. So again, reforms that can be undertaken domestically, and there are countries that have undertaken it. In each of these areas, you can point to very good examples, in terms of improving the business environment. For example, if you look at countries like the Dominican Republic, they're doing great work in improving their business environment. If you look at countries like Costa Rica, Panama, for example, they've also made progress in this area. Then, of course, there are other areas where countries in the region, again, there are differences across countries, but they tend to score, not in very high positions. It's everything that is related to skills, because there's a significant skills mismatch in most Latin American countries, where the education system sort of results or produces graduates that are not exactly what the market or what companies are demanding. So, implementing policies that can close the gap is probably a way to go. And one can identify like that. I think that one can identify a number of areas that impact the competitiveness of Latin American countries. There are variations by countries, but there is, it's not because there's a lack of an agenda that progress is not made. It's because it's important to tackle that agenda.
The last question, please go ahead.
Thank you for being here. I have a question about regional integration. And so it seems like that, like for example, I'm thinking of Brazil, where like under the Lula administration, he was very interested in making Brazil a regional leader and engaging with neighbors. But then, in subsequent administrations that we see now, it seems like Brazil, for example, is taking more of an isolationist role or less willing to engage with their neighbors. But of course, this impacts integration efforts and long-term planning if you can't count on administrations to be consistently interested in pursuing like the policies of predecessors. And so how can integration efforts in Latin America, maybe, or I should say regional integration efforts, maybe insulate themselves from political volatility to increase trade?
Question. I would say that regional integration to advance progress in regional integration, you need both top-down measures, but also bottom-up support. And the top-down comes from government's initiatives, and there are some interesting initiatives like that in the region. The Pacific Alliance is one. This ADD is another one. But to sustain these initiatives over time, you need the engagement of the business community. And the business community is what can provide you with that sort of insurance, if you wish, against changes in governments over time. If the business community sees value in regional integration, which is also, I think, suggests what an agenda of regional integration should look like. Again, reducing red tape, eliminating barriers, all this. The business community will continue to work with governments to make integration happen. This to me goes to the point that I think it's important to anchor integration in Latin America in what's of interest to business, I think.
For the questions, we're almost reaching our limit of time. I want to thank you, Annabelle, for this great conversation, for being here, for making time in a busy week here in Washington, D.C. with the IMF and World Bank meetings. I know that you have a full agenda there. And let's just give a round of applause to Annabelle before I turn to Alejandro for some closing remarks. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Well, just to thank you, Annabelle, for a great talk. I definitely enjoy your view on, you call it two-track approach for Latin American countries, the multilateral and the regional, but you went far beyond that, including this other dimension sub-regional agreements on sectoral issues, on different policies, etc. And I think your view on what has been stalling integration within Latin America has been extremely important. I would add that, I mean, traditionally, Brazil has been one of the closest countries in the world. And Mexico has looked to the north and not so much to the rest of the region. Being the two largest economies in Latin America, I would say that if one day you have the political will of these two countries to start negotiating a regional integration agreement, I would tend to think that it would be very hard for the rest of the region not to follow suit. But now it's kind of whether you form part of, let's say, the North American bloc and CAFTA and Central America looking north, or more of the Southern Cone countries with Mercosur. So hopefully, I mean, we will have the political leadership to move on that. But I think the topics that Annabelle mentioned today on regional integration, on how to use a multilateral system, how climate change and trade are also coming together in a very important agenda, and how digital services and the whole trading services issue could be also a significant lever for Latin America to look for development. So I think, I mean, today's talk has been extremely rich, deep, and engaging. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And with that, let's give Annabelle and Tony another applause, and really thank you for being here.